Okay, we are going to get started. Welcome everyone. Just as a reminder, this event is being recorded. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Foner, and I work in the Office of Alumni Relations at Northeastern on our affinity and domestic engagement team. So first, just a couple housekeeping items. Please make sure that you keep your microphone on mute, just so we can have a good sound quality through the duration of the program. If you have any questions or having any issues, please feel free to use the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye on it. Amanda, our wonderful host for the evening, is going to be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then there will be time for Q&A at the end. And again, at that time, if you could put your questions into the chat box, I can read them out loud. You can either send them to me directly, privately, or post them in the group chat. Either way is fine. So now I'm going to turn the floor over to our San Francisco Bay Area community leader, the very festive Laurent Perrier.
Hello, thank you, Stephanie. Had to any excuse to be festive these days. Need all the holiday cheer we can get. I'm Lauren Dibble. I am a double Husky. I finished my undergrad in 2009 and did my MBA at Northeastern in 2015. And I've been out in the Bay Area for the last 4 years and have had the pleasure of meeting a lot of the alumni out here during pre-COVID times. We did monthly social hours and a number of other events, but we've done a couple virtual events specific for the Bay Area community during the pandemic, and definitely planning to do more and looking forward to post-pandemic times when we can all get together. But really excited for this event. I think it's going to be a great way to celebrate together and connect virtually and learn some new things. And so I think, certainly want to find as many ways to connect and support the Bay Area community. And so if you have ideas for similar events that you might want to host or participate in, would love your suggestions. You can reach out to me or you can reach out to Stephanie, but really there's a lot of different ways that you can work with the alumni office to get involved or to see kind of suggest programming that you might want to participate in. So if I have it, for those of you I haven't met, I hope to get to, but excited to learn together tonight. So anything I missed, Stephanie, in terms of Bay Area stuff? Otherwise, I will introduce our honored host for the evening. Amanda Streibel is a certified sommelier and mixologist with more than 20 years of experience, both domestically and abroad. After her time at Northeastern, she moved to Australia to study cocktail culture, and upon returning to the States, she's spent time working in some of the country's top restaurants, including those helmed by chefs Charlie Palmer and David Ballou. So we're really excited to turn it over to Amanda so we can learn about sparkling wines, the fun wine, although I don't know what wine is not fun, but maybe Amanda will tell us. So.
Exactly. All wine is fun. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me this evening. Definitely. Wine is meant to be enjoyed and shared and absolutely always fun, but it's pretty hard to not have a smile on your face when you have a glass of bubbles in your hand. And even if you were in a bad mood, it usually does a pretty good job of being able to turn your day around. So to start off, what actually is sparkling wine? So sparkling wine is any wine that is made effervescent with carbon dioxide. It's as simple as that. It can be red, white, rosé, doesn't matter what grape it comes from, and it is produced all over the world. So any country, there's no regulations as to anything that can be considered sparkling wine. It's as simple as it sounds. So the common types of sparkling wine being Champagne, Prosecco, Cava, Cremant, Lambrusco, Brachetto. We're going to spend a lot of time, or most of the time rather, this evening speaking about Champagne and Prosecco with kind of some key hints to Cava and Cremant, because those are the things that I find most people have specific questions about, and also the things that are most prevalent at events and your table. So why not focus on the things that most people drink most often? So there are 6 types of ways that sparkling wine is made throughout the world. It is the Champagne method being the most prevalent, then Charmont or the tank method, transfer method, Ancestral, carbonation, or the continuous method. So all sparkling wine is made in one of these 6 different styles. So moving right into Champagne. So only in Champagne is it called the Champagne method. In other parts of the world, even though it's produced in the exact same style and it's the same production, by law, Champagne method is just reserved for the Champagne region of France. Otherwise, it's called the traditional method or method champenois. So those are the 2 key terms that you'd be looking for when purchasing a wine of this style on a label. That's really the key here, is how do you know if it's made in that same style? Those are the key words that are there for. And the biggest thing about this particular method is that it is second fermentated in the bottle. So all still wine goes through a fermentation process where the sugars in the grapes are converted into alcohol by yeast. That is fermentation. That is true for things as far as kombucha is concerned, beer, everything. It's the amount of yeast breaking down those sugars and turning them into alcohol. That can be a winemaker's decision based on how much alcohol is actually in your wine. So for example, something like dessert wine from Italy, Moscato d'Asti, usually has a much lower alcohol content at about 5% or so. And then something like Champagne, you're looking at about 12% or so mostly. And then something like a still wine, like a California Cabernet, can be 15, even 16% sometimes, all based on when the winemaker decides to stop that fermentation process and that sugar alcohol conversion. So the Champagne method, how does it actually work? So the sugar added to wine only comes in the fact for second fermentation by liquor de triage. So it's an additional solution that's added to the still wine to activate the second fermentation process. So what that does is after it's been initially fermented and turned into a still wine that has no bubbles or effervescence to it, this liquor de triage is added. So there's an additional element of yeast and sugar so that the yeast can continue to break that down in the bottle to create champagne. So the wine sits on what's called the lees, which is dead yeast particles that aid in the aging process. So the lees are particles that sit on the wine in the bottle, and which is why you need to go through the process of what's called riddling. So riddling is where you turn the bottle a quarter turn every day in order to move those lees around throughout the bottle and make sure that every part of the liquid that's in the bottle is touching all of the yeast and aging the wine properly and thoroughly throughout. So then what happens from that point in time is the cork is shot off the top of the bottle and all of the lees and everything that came to the top are out of the wine. So it's now a filtered, clear wine. So there's no sediment or cloudiness to any of the champagne, which is why you're able to see through champagne, whether it be rosé or just a standard cuvée. You're able to see through that because of the process of riddling. And then you go to the process of dosage. And what dosage is the amount of sugar that is added into the wine. Champagne is a region in France that's very far north. So the climate in general is much cooler. So what that means is that you're going to get a more acidic and tart fruit delivered from the vines. So you need to add a certain amount of sugar to balance out that acid, because your acid and sugar levels always need to be in harmony so that it's not a sweet tart instead of, or something too jammy where the sugar is much more prevalent or the acid is much more prevalent. So dosage marries that acid process to the amount of sugar that's in the wine. So as you've probably seen on different labels throughout champagne, it's always really hard to kind of differentiate what type of champagne you're trying to buy because of all the different classifications and different words that are there. So champagne is made from 3 grapes: Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. Then that's going to create a standard cuvée. So all of your wines, like let's say, for example, Veuve Clicquot, that yellow label that most people are used to seeing, that's going to be their standard cuvée bottling. And it's going to be a marriage of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. And the reason for that is because Champagne is so far north, it can be a bit volatile. So the Chardonnay crop might be better one year, the Pinot Noir crop might be better one year, or Pinot Meunier might do really well to add in the process of blending to make sure that you're getting a really even wine production throughout the course of year over year and throughout that individual year. So that champagne houses become known for their individual style more so than it was a great year. Sometimes there are great years and you can produce a vintage wine. Let's say 2002, for example, absolutely stellar year in Champagne. Most champagne houses produced a wine from 2002 where all the grapes were sourced from that particular year. Now, let's say you were to buy a bottle of that same Veuve Clicquot this year, you might have Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier from 3 different years, all blended into the same bottle to create that cuvée. Also that the winemaker can create an even and stylistically appropriate wine for that particular champagne house. So then breaking it down after cuvée, we also have Blanc de Blanc, which is going to be 100% Chardonnay, or a Blanc de Noir, which is going to be 100% Pinot Noir. Pinot Meunier is just added into the cuvées in order to blend. That's also true for rosé cuvées for champagne. And then as I was speaking about before, the dosage with champagne goes from doux, demi-sec, and sec, which are considered your dessert champagnes. And then you move into extra sec, brut, extra brut, and brut nature being your driest of your wines with the different styles. So brut nature has absolutely no sugar added, and then it goes up just a little by little as you move through. So brut nature wines are extremely dry, as I mentioned. And dry is one of those things that I always like to go over to make sure people really understand what that word means, especially when trying to order a wine or purchase a wine that is dry. Because what that basically says is that you're looking for a wine that is not sweet. And the best way I can explain how dry a wine is if you've ever had a cup of oversteeped black tea where it pulls all of the moisture out of the back of your mouth and sucks all that saliva right on out. That's a dry wine. So that's going to be your brut nature or some of your natural wines that have absolutely no sugar and are a little bit more acidic because of that, because they don't necessarily have the sugar to balance out the acid. Some of them are made in wonderful styles, don't get me wrong, but there's just absolutely no sugar, and there is a place for sugar in most wine production. So then we move on still in the champagne method of production, being second fermentated in the bottle. So part of what that does as well is it makes all the bubbles in your sparkling wine really tight and small and makes your carbonation last for a very long period of time, because each bottle has created its own natural carbonation by the addition of that liquor de triage and then the amount of dosage that goes into the wine. So your champagnes will stay more carbonated for a longer period of time after opening the bottle than, let's say, something like Prosecco, for example. I'll speak more about that as we get into Prosecco and that production. So Cremant is the name of another type of wine made in the champagne style or method champenois or traditional method, produced in France. So it could be any other region in France, such as Alsace or the Jura, Loire, Bourgogne, or Burgundy, that makes a sparkling wine that is second fermentated in the bottle. And that can be made from any grape. Pinot Blanc, Riesling, Chardonnay, Pinot Gris, Aligate, it doesn't matter. Any other grape can be made into a Cremant as long as it's produced in France. Then for Spain, the word is Cava. Same production, different grape varietals, because different grape varietals do better in Spain because the climate is obviously much warmer than other areas in France based on where they're located throughout the nation, with main grapes being Xarello, Macabeo, Malvasia, and all of those wines do a little better, or excuse me, all of those grapes do a little bit better in the heat of Spain, just creating a better wine for Cava. Cremant and Cava are absolutely fantastic options that are more budget friendly than Champagne would be. Champagne's a small region. There's not a lot of champagne houses. That has a lot to do with the price of champagne in general. There's also a lot of legal requirements to produce in Champagne. So that has a lot to do with the price, where Cremant and Cava can be absolutely fantastic wines, really delicious and still made in that same style, really tight, fine bubbles that are absolutely excellent. Okay, so then we move on to the Charmont or the tank method. So it's named for a man named Charmont who created this method, and the liquor de triage is added to large tanks. So this wine is not fermented second in the bottle. It's done so in these large quantities and then bottled after the fact. So a lot of these wines are really youthful, really clean in fruit flavors, have a ton of aromatics, and are meant to be drank young. It doesn't have as much carbonation, so the bubbles are going to be bigger, and you will lose the bubbles a little bit faster because it doesn't have what we call as much atmospheres of pressure. So Champagne holds about 5 to 6 atmospheres of pressure, give or take, per bottle, where Prosecco, you're looking at about 1.5 atmospheres of pressure. So it's going to be a much smaller retention there. So Prosecco, probably the most common sparkling wine in the States. Everybody loves it, and you should. It's a delicious wine. Prosecco is the region. Prosecco is not a grape. And Prosecco is not a style. Charmant is the style, or the tank method is the style of the wine. Prosecco is the region. It's located in the northeast of the Veneto and southwest of Friuli. And there's 2 designations for Prosecco, DOC and DOCG. DOC and DOCG is true for all wines throughout Italy based on the governmentary regulations and designations of vineyard sites. DOC is great wine. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with the DOC. DOCG is a higher classification of wine. So you know for sure your grapes are coming from a better vineyard site, and therefore, more often than not, tends to yield a better product. Glera is the grape that Prosecco is made from. 100% Glera is always Prosecco. And then the amount of sweetness levels for Prosecco go Brut, Extra Brut, which is counterintuitive. Brut is actually the driest, and then Extra Brut is next, into dry, and then into demi-sec being your sweetest. And as I mentioned before, there's usually about 1.5 atmospheres of pressure compared to Champagne's 5.6. So here's where I'm going to talk about glassware for a second. So Champagne flutes, you're able to see the bubbles rise and you're able to see the size of the bubbles, which is why champagne flutes are the preferred glassware for that particular style of wine, so that you as the consumer visually are able to see immediately how much bubbles is in your wine and the speed at which they're rising and how large they are. So therefore, visually, you'd be able to tell what style of wine this is, particularly for sparkling, versus your wine glass, which is going to create a larger surface area and more oxygen to get into your wine, which will dissipate the bubbles faster. So your bubbles will hold tighter and for longer in champagne flutes than it will in a wine glass. But if what you're looking for is the aromatics and being able to get your nose into the wine, then you go with a wine glass. Couple of general points about glassware. Please always hold your glasses by the stem. Reason for that is your hands hold a ton of smell. So in this day and age, whether it's soap, hand sanitizer, whatever the case may be, anything that you ate, if you were eating hors d'oeuvres or anything like that, when you're having sparkling wine, you always want to hold it by the stem because that's going to be further away from your mouth. And you never want to hold wine glasses like this for a couple of reasons. Predominantly, you're heating the liquid that is inside the glass. And then the secondary reason, of course, being, again, the smell off your hands is coming much closer to your face as you're enjoying the wine, and it's clouding the ability to actually nose your wine because your olfactory and your nose is such a huge part of how you taste as well. Okay. All right, so then we move on to the transfer method, which is a hybrid of champagne and the tank method. So second fermentation does happen in the bottle, but all of the sediment is filtered in the tank. So unlike champagne, where it's riddled all to the top and then corked off and dosaged, this sediment is filtered in the tank and then packaged into new bottles. This method happens most frequently when you're talking about very large formats, much larger than a Magnum. A Magnum is just a double bottle. We're talking here about wine bottles that are 6 liters, 9 liters, 15 liters, things like that, where it's very difficult to riddle those bottles, because to turn a 15-liter bottle by the 1/4 inch every day, not only do champagne makers have a ton of carpal tunnel before it became posh with keyboards, doing so with a large format bottle is just extremely heavy and impractical. So the wine is then filtered in the tank, packaged into new bottles, and then second fermentated in those large format bottles. All right, and then we move on to the Ancestral Method. So this is the oldest method to make sparkling wines, and it's transferred from the tank to the bottle before the first fermentation is complete. So what that means is all of that original yeast for the first fermentation, as well as the second, is all going into the bottle. So oftentimes what that means is that it's going to be cloudy because it's an unfiltered wine. So just as Blue Moon, Allagash, or Frankenskaner are unfiltered beers, Pet Nat wines are unfiltered sparkling wines. So usually they're quite cloudy, they're finished under cap typically, and they don't have as much effervescence. These are wines that by nature are extremely dry because there's no dosage added. So because of the transfer from the tank before the completion of the first fermentation. So the first and the second fermentation all happen in the bottle under cap. So you're not getting a chance to kind of retool the wine before it undergoes its second fermentation in order to create its effervescence. So then we go into the carbonation method, which is just as it sounds. So it's forced carbonation of still wine. So think soda stream. If you have one of those, then you understand the concept. It's really just pushing CO2 into any still wine. Generally speaking, this is not an accepted method of production for sparkling wine, especially not for high quality sparkling wines. It happens. The availability of ready to drink sparkling things out of a can is much more frequent these days. And that is a lot of how these wines are able to be carbonated and then effectively canned for resale as a ready to drink option, instead of like champagne, for example, which is obviously reflected in the price, is second fermented individually in each bottle so that each wine has a steady stream of carbonation. Then there's the continuous method. So this is mostly used in German sect production. So the liquor triage is added continuously to the tank of still wines. So as it's moving through the large tank of still wines, that's when the liquor de triage is added. And then it tends to oftentimes be filtered over oak chips. That helps with the filtering process to remove some of that sediment and lees, as well as yeast from the wine, and it adds to the richness of the wine. So instead of it spending time in oak, fermenting during its first fermentation process, this all happens continuously to the tank of still wines and then gets finished afterwards. So quick point about German wines in general, they do produce quite a bit of sparkling wine in Germany. It's just that most of it does not get exported to the United States because the Germans consume so much of it. I'm going to go on a little tangent here to go off of sparkling wines for a quick second, because the same is true for the Germans with Riesling. It's only in recent years that we've seen much more Riesling production come out of Germany to the United States. And why Riesling, for example, was known in most Americans' minds as a very sweet wine for so many years, because what's known as Trocken, which is the most dry of Riesling production in Germany, wasn't exported to the United States. The Germans drank it all. So now we're very grateful that they are exporting more and producing more, and are being able to share their wines throughout the world, because they really do make some great wines. The production of it has just not actually gotten to the United States that frequently. So these are things that you're definitely going to find in your smaller wine shops. You're probably not going to find these in any of your bigger supermarket wine stores at all, just because of the amount of production that's made. Okay, so how do you buy these wines? How do you know from what I was just talking about onto a label, and how do you decode it a little bit? So if we take a look at the Veuve Clicquot label there, you can see Champagne, because Champagne is the region, Veuve Clicquot is the producer, and then Brut being the amount of sugar that is in that wine. So Brut is going to be your third step up, because it's Brut Nature, Extra Brut, and then Brut. That's going to be pretty much true for all of your standard cuvées, which are going to be your blend, again, of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier, possibly blended over 3 years, so that this Veuve Clicquot Champagne is going to be consistent every time you pick one up. So that as you move over into the Prosecco in the center there, the Mionetto is the producer, Prosecco is the region, it is a DOC designation, and then Treviso is the DOC designation itself, with Brut being its sweetness level, which for Prosecco is the driest you're going to get. Okay, so then we go into the Cava, where it's Brut Nature, so that's extremely dry. Gran Reserva is its designation, meaning it's the highest possible quality from Spain. Juvet y Champs is the producer, and then 2004 is going to be the year. And all the grapes in that, regardless of the grapes that they used, because they don't have to publish their blends on the labels, just like Veuve Clicquot doesn't have to say exactly what blend of champagne of grape varietals they're using. Same is true for Cava. So then on to the next one. So the Laurent Perrier here is a Cuvée Rosé. So that just means it's still a blend of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Pinot Meunier. It just means that the grapes spent a little more time sitting on the skins as they were being pressed in order to achieve that rosé color. Again, the blend is unknown and could be over 3 years. So Laurent Perrier is the producer, Champagne is the region, Cuvée Rosé is telling you what it is, and then 1812 is just the year of the inception of Laurent Perrier as a champagne house. So then again, with our Cremonta Alsace there, so Cremont being the style, Alsace being the region in France that it was produced, and then Brut Nature being the sweetness level designation. Okay, so what does this mean when you're buying all of these wines? The biggest advice I could give you is to build a relationship with a local wine shop. The reason why I say that is because they're going to be more apt to bring in independent producers that you might not see in larger wine shops, and you'd be able to find some more unique and individualized wines. And as someone gets to know your taste better, they're able to make better and better selections for you, because the more you can tell somebody about what you like better, even better is the more you can tell somebody about what you don't like. Please do not be afraid to talk to local people just because you're buying a $15 or $20 bottle of wine. They want to build that relationship with you to make sure that the next time you come back, you'll come back to them for that $15 or $20 bottle. Especially in 2020 and everyone in this business, it's never been more important to shop local. So I really can't stress that enough. And then please always buy more than you will drink. 90% of the wine that is consumed in this country is consumed within 24 hours of its purchase. There's nothing wrong with buying a bottle, taking it home and consuming it. Absolutely not. But oftentimes you're unable to truly identify why you like one style, one wine, or one varietal better than the next if you're not able to open something side by side and have a Charmont next to a Cava to understand the difference between the grape varietals used in the production or the region. Because if you're drinking it on its own, it's all bubbles and it's delicious. And that is 100% true. But if you're able to buy, let's say, for example, 2 half bottles of something, you can open them side by side and really get a better understanding for your particular palate and why you like or don't like something. It's always fun to add in a new wine, something you've never tried before, because what's the worst thing that's going to happen, right? There is a wine at every budget. Do not feel like you have to spend a lot to have a really delicious wine. Pricing and the delicious factor do not always add up. A lot of that has to do with tariffs and regulatory information, the amount of wine that was actually produced by that particular house that year, how much wine was produced that vintage for that year, and then the buying power of the place that you're actually shopping in. So pricing has a lot to do with all of those factors, and there's many, many delicious wines at every single price point. So whatever you're comfortable with is what you should spend, and you should never feel bad about that, because at the end of the day, you can't take anything with you after that bottle. The only thing you're going to have is the memories that you created while enjoying it. And if you feel a type of way about the price, then it wasn't worth it. So if you won't drink it, please don't cook with it. That's a big one. If it's not going to be delicious in your palate as a beverage, it's not going to be delicious in your food. So just some quick pairing tips as well, which there's going to be an email that's sent out after that includes some additional pairing information and some more buying advice, as well as along with a list of Champagne, Prosecco, Cava, and Cremant at every price point, whether it's some producers that I love or just some really interesting wines that are all available nationally. So anybody in any of your local shops should be able to tell you more about these wines or where you'd be able to source them if for some reason they didn't carry them on their own, or at least give you some recommendations that were relatively similar. So it's always a good idea to pair your wine with the sauce that you're creating, not necessarily the protein. The proteins can change and fluctuate and adapt taste-wise based on the sauce that they are with. And wines really tend to sing based on the fat content to the acid content, and a lot of that has to do with the sauce. So quick rule of thumb, white sauce, great with a white wine. Red sauce, great with a red wine. If it sounds good to you, it probably is. And don't be afraid to try it. Don't let someone like me or someone who might know a lot about a wine in your circle sway what you like. You should drink what you like, and that's the bottom line at the end of the day. So, and again, as I mentioned before, opening wines side by side is such an incredible way to really get to know your particular palate and understand the differences, whether it be vintages, grape varietals, production styles, and it really can open the world of wine if you do that. So, any questions?
Great. Thank you, Amanda. The chat box is open. If you feeling a little shy, you can just send me a question directly. That's also totally fine. Okay, so first question in, what is the best temperature for storage for sparkling wines to maintain them?
So generally speaking, wines across the board, if you're looking to store them over a long period of time, you should be looking somewhere in the 55 to 62 degree neighborhood. You don't want to keep them ice cold, like in the refrigerator or anything like that. But you definitely don't want to keep them at, let's say, a room temperature if you plan to store them for, let's say, anything longer than a year or two. Because what heat will do is accelerate the aging process of your wine. This is also true for smaller format bottles, and it all has to do with light and oxygen. Corks are porous, and glass is a supercooled liquid, not a solid. So the more light that's able to get into your wine and the more air that's able to get in via the cork, the faster your wines will age. And heat accelerates that process, which is the reasoning for storing your wines at a temperature that is a bit cooler and a bit more regulated, and if at all possible, with as little vibrations as possible. So above the fridge, not really a great place to store wines for long-term storage.
I have a question. Does sparkling wine age, or if the longer you keep it, the less flavorful or it gets? What's the general concept on aging sparkling wines or so?
Sure. So wines are absolutely able to be aged just like any other still wine. Generally speaking, their flavor profile will intensify over time. As another kind of general rule of thumb, which is 100% true for sparkling wines as well, the more acid and the more sugar a wine has, usually matched at that level. So let's say a demi-sec champagne is going to show signs of age much less over, let's say, a period of 10 years than a standard cuvee would. So over time, your wines will start to brown if they're white wines, or they'll start to deepen in color if they're rosés. And if they're red wines, they can actually tend to lose a little bit of color. And that happens just, again, generally from the air and light implications for those wines, but you can absolutely let standard cuvées age and it will round out the flavor for you. And soften the carbonation. The carbonation will definitely dissipate over time. So if you're going to open a bottle of champagne from the 1980s, it's definitely not going to be as effervescent as something that was bottled last year, for example. That's going to have your most amount of carbonation to it.
As this is the season of eating and smaller group gathering, could you provide some recommendations for maybe like a red, a white, and a sparkling for traditional kind of holiday food fare pairing?
Sure. So especially if you're serving a lot of people, I think Cava or Cremant is an excellent choice because it's much more budget friendly. The wines are delicious and anything fried goes really well with bubbles. Fried food is always a great place to start, as is anything shellfish related. A lot of the fat content in shellfish and the richness of shrimp, lobster, crab are really married quite nicely with the effervescence and the acid in sparkling wines. You're able to cut that fat with the acid and really bring your palate to light to be able to do that. For white wines, particularly Gruners are great with salads or anything asparagus related. Anything green tends to go great with Gruner Veltliners or Sauvignon Blancs across the board, whether that Sauvignon Blanc be a Sancerre or something from the Marlborough in New Zealand. Those are going to be really great with your salads or anything a little bit lighter there because they're a little bit thinner wines. They're not big and fat and chunky. So they're going to be able to cut through with that crispness of the vegetables. And then I'm always a huge fan of Chateauneuf du Pape, which is Grenache is a predominant grape in the blend there for Old World. So when I say Old World, I'm talking about France in this particular case. Wines or Pinot Noirs are great with duck. It's a really great pairing. I know that's not a protein that everyone has as much, but I feel like, you know, the old cab and a slab is done. So steak and, you know, some big old California Cabernet, while delicious, I feel like I wanted to give you something else that was a little more specific. Demi-sec champagne and key lime pie, one of my favorites, or grapefruit or anything super citrusy like that.
What type of sparkling wine would make a great gift this holiday season?
I always love to give champagne because a standard cuvee from any of the major champagne houses is always going to be received fantastically. Giving Cremonts or Cavas are wonderful. Don't get me wrong, or Proseccos, they're absolutely fantastic. But giving a bottle of champagne just kind of adds that special little touch that someone might not have bought themselves, whether it be for price or their general nature about knowledge and why buy champagne when there's other bubble choices. I think a lot of it just has to do with the production and how it's a really special corner of the world that makes some pretty excellent stuff.
If someone is interested in becoming a sommelier, where's a good place to start? Classes? Is there a type of degree? Any guidance?
Sure. So the Court of Master Sommeliers is the governing body that I chose to go through back when I did my certifications and things. There's in the buying guide, actually, I also provided a reference for this woman, Madeline, who's absolutely excellent. She produces a lot of really great content. And most of the wine community is huge on sharing knowledge. So number one is ask, start talking to your local wine shops. They usually will connect you with other somms at whether it be nearby restaurants or to just have conversations about wine. Getting into a tasting group is a great way to do that as well, and taste a bunch of different wines all at a time, or start one, just to have, you know, a few friends over and go through and taste different wines. Everybody can bring something. You can do it blind, you cannot, especially as you're starting to go through. And then there's local schools and local resources based on exactly where you're located, that you'd be able to reach out to for particular schools or anything like that. And the Wine for Dummies book is really great. It's a great intro and a really great jumping off point. It's easy to read. It's a great 101 to start.
Are California sparkling wines on par with those of France, Spain, and Italy?
They can be. There's wonderful producers in California, Oregon, Washington that are making some truly fantastic wines. As far as the new world making quality just as much as the old world does, absolutely. The only thing that it truly is missing is the international prestige and recognition. I also think, in particular, domestically, you do have to jump price point a bit to get some more of those quality wines that are produced in the States. American wine production, particularly with regards to sparkling, started off as really a mass production kind of situation. It has since dialed itself back in recent years and is focusing more on quality. So more over time, I think there are going to be better and better domestic productions, sparkling wise, that are going to be more affordable. But right now, I would say if you can make that price jump, there are amazing domestic sparkling wines and great options, especially on the general baseline of like 25 to 30 a bottle. Doing them side by side, you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference between some Cremont and Cava productions.
What are you drinking and enjoying these days? What makes you happy?
Being able to drink anything with other people, honestly, these days. But while that is not an option, I've been in a little bit of a Northern Rhone phase for myself right now, which is kind of niche and specific, but Assams tend to go through we're pretty fluid when it comes to wines. But my standard answer to that question is always, there's never a bad time for champagne, especially this time of year. It's always, you know, some really great stuff, and you always feel special when you get to have a glass of champagne.
And I think that is a great note to end on. So as Amanda said, she pulled together a really wonderful guide that's a few pages, and I will be sending out, oh, we have another question, and then I will circle back to my endpoints. For someone that enjoys Pinot Noir, which sparkling wines would you recommend?
So for Pinot Noir, Cremonta Alsace rosés are going to have a good amount of Pinot Noir in them usually, and they're usually quite affordable. In the buying guide, there are a couple of producers that do some really great rosés. There are some Rosé Cava is much harder to come by because Pinot Noir by nature doesn't grow as well in such a warm climate in Spain. So you're going to want to look more in the Alsace region, or the Cuvée Rosés from Champagne, Billecart Simon or Laurent Perrier. Laurent Perrier is one of my personal favorites. That is a really, really beautiful wine and Pinot Noir dominant.
Okay, last call. Okay, great. So again, the guide will be coming out by the end of the week, as will a recording of this event. So you will have the presentation to refer to and Amanda's comments and answers to refer to. And it was so great to have you all join us, and we will see you next year in 2021. So
Happy
bye,
holidays,
everyone.
everybody.